The evening air was thick with summer humidity as Mai walked through the sliding doors of Memorial General Hospital, one hand pressed against her lower abdomen, the other gripping her husband Dev's arm. Just 3 days after giving birth to their beautiful baby girl, something didn't feel right. The pain was different from the expected postpartum discomfort, sharper, more intense, and growing worse by the hour. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they approached the emergency department desk. Mi's normally confident voice shook slightly as she explained her symptoms to the intake nurse, who barely looked up from her computer screen. "Fill these out," the nurse said flatly, sliding a stack of forms across the counter. When Mai tried to explain that she was experiencing severe pain and dizziness, the nurse cut her off with a wave of her hand. "Everyone has to follow the same process, ma'am." Dev helped Mai to a hard plastic chair in the waiting room, where they spent the next 45 minutes completing paperwork while she winced in pain. Other patients came and went, some arriving after them, but being called back almost immediately. Each time the door opened, Mai looked up hopefully, only to sink back in disappointment. 3 hours passed. The waiting room had mostly emptied, yet Mai remained seated, now doubled over and breathing heavily. Dev made 4 separate trips to the desk, each time being told they needed to wait their turn. "Post-birth discomfort is normal," one staff member said with a dismissive smile, speaking unnecessarily slowly and loudly as if Mai couldn't understand English. Many new mothers get anxious over nothing. What made the situation even more frustrating was how the same staff fawned over another new mother who had arrived, a woman who matched their own background. They spoke to her warmly, brought her water, and quickly found her a room. Meanwhile, Mi's attempts to explain her symptoms in perfect English were met with patronizing nods and suggestions to calm down. Dev noticed how the staff exchanged looks when they heard Mi's accent, how they made assumptions about her understanding of medical care. He watched his wife, who had spent countless nights studying medical journals during her pregnancy to ensure she knew every possible complication, being treated like she was clueless about her own body. The pain was becoming unbearable. Mi's vision started to blur around the edges, and the room felt like it was spinning. A young nurse walked past, and Mai reached out to grab her sleeve. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "something is seriously wrong. I know my body, and this isn't normal postpartum pain." The nurse extracted her arm from Mi's grip and adjusted her sleeve. "Mrs." She glanced at the clipboard, stumbling over the surname. "You'll have to wait your turn like everyone else." First-time mothers often overreact to normal recovery symptoms. She walked away, leaving Mai fighting back tears of pain and frustration. As the clock ticked past midnight and into early morning, the shift change brought new staff to the department. Dev was helping Mai return from another difficult trip to the bathroom when she stumbled, nearly collapsing. A cleaning staff member who happened to be nearby showed more concern than any of the medical professionals had all night, rushing to help support her and calling out for assistance. Little did the hospital staff know that their next shift would bring a revelation that would completely change their approach to Mai's care. But why should that have mattered? The question hung heavy in the air. Why did a patient's status have to change how deserving they were of basic medical attention and human dignity? The night seemed endless as Mai struggled to make herself heard. Each time she tried to explain her symptoms, the medical staff treated her like a child who didn't understand basic English. The young nurse at the station kept speaking to her in an exaggerated, slow voice that made Mi's blood boil despite her weakening state. "Like I said before," Mai explained, gripping the counter to stay steady, "I'm experiencing severe cramping, much worse than normal postpartum pain. There's also dizziness, and—" She couldn't finish her sentence as another wave of pain hit her. The nurse simply handed her a glass of water and suggested she should try to relax. Dev watched helplessly as his wife, who had meticulously documented every aspect of her pregnancy in a detailed journal, attempted to share her medical history. The staff's eyes would glaze over whenever she used medical terminology, assuming she must have misunderstood something she'd read on the internet. One nurse even chuckled when Mai mentioned the specific medications she'd been prescribed, as if she couldn't possibly know such details. My blood pressure during pregnancy was consistently. Mai started to explain, but the nurse interrupted her. Sweetie, why don't you let us handle the medical talk? Just tell us if something hurts. The patronizing tone made Dev's jaw clench, but they both knew that getting angry would only make things worse. A doctor finally passed through, spending barely 30 seconds glancing at Mai before declaring it was probably just anxiety. New mothers often worry too much, he said, speaking to Dev rather than me, as if she wasn't even in the room. Just keep an eye on her. He walked away before Mai could describe the shooting pains that were now spreading across her abdomen. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, seeming to grow louder with each passing hour. Mai noticed how other patients who came in after her were quickly attended to, their concerns taken seriously from the moment they spoke. She watched as a woman with a twisted ankle was immediately given pain medication and wheeled to X-ray, while she sat there, potentially experiencing serious postpartum complications. Dev made another attempt to advocate for his wife, approaching the desk with forced calmness. My wife is in serious pain, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She's been tracking her symptoms carefully, and this isn't normal for her recovery. The nurse barely looked up from her phone, muttering something about patients and hospital protocols. Time seemed to move in slow motion. Mai's detailed explanations about her medical history, her carefully tracked symptoms, and her understanding of potential postpartum complications fell on deaf ears. One staff member even suggested she watch some YouTube videos about normal postpartum recovery, as if she hadn't spent months researching and preparing for this exact period. The pain continued to intensify, and Mai's vision began to blur more frequently. She tried standing up to walk to the bathroom and nearly collapsed. Dev caught her just in time, his face etched with worry. Please, he called out to the staff, something's really wrong. But their response was merely to suggest she remain seated and stop moving around so much. Through the haze of pain and frustration, Mai could hear the staff talking among themselves at the station. These first-time moms, one whispered, not quite quietly enough. They read 2 articles online and think they know everything. Another responded with a knowing laugh, completely unaware that their patient's knowledge went far beyond a few Google searches. As the night shift prepared to hand over to the morning staff, Mai's condition continued to deteriorate. The same staff who had dismissed her concerns for hours walked past without a second glance, more focused on finishing their paperwork than checking on the struggling patient. They had no idea that the morning shift would bring a revelation that would make them question every assumption they'd made that night. Little did they know, their display of prejudice and negligence would soon turn into a powerful lesson about checking their biases and treating every patient with the dignity they deserve, regardless of their background or status. The breaking point came just before dawn. Mai's pain had become so intense that she could barely speak, her words coming out in short gasps. The waiting room, now mostly empty except for a few night shift stragglers, felt like it was closing in around her. Her normally olive complexion had turned pale, and cold sweat beaded on her forehead. Dev had never felt so helpless in his life. His wife, who had always been the strong one, the one with all the answers, was now slumping against him, barely able to keep her eyes open. He raised his hand for what felt like the 100th time that night, trying to get someone's attention. Please, he called out, his voice cracking with desperation, my wife needs help now. A junior nurse finally walked over, clipboard in hand, wearing an expression that mixed boredom with irritation. Sir, like we've told you before, post-birth discomfort is completely normal. If you keep causing a disturbance, we'll have to ask you to. She stopped mid-sentence as Mai suddenly lurched forward, clutching her stomach. I can't. Mai tried to explain through gritted teeth. The room was spinning faster now, colors blurring together like a watercolor painting left in the rain. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, drowning out the dismissive voice of the nurse who was still lecturing about typical new mother anxiety. The cleaning lady who had helped earlier during her shift passed by again, noticed May's deteriorating condition, and rushed over. Unlike the medical staff, she showed genuine concern. "Something's not right," she said firmly to the nurse. "Look at her color. This isn't normal." It took a stranger, someone without medical training, to state what should have been obvious to the professionals. But the nurse merely sighed, making a show of checking her watch. "Ma'am, we have protocols to follow. There are other patients." Another wave of pain hit May, this time so severe that she couldn't hold back a cry of agony. The sound echoed through the waiting room, causing the few remaining patients to look up in alarm. Dev had reached his limit. Standing up, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger, he demanded to speak to a supervisor. "This is unacceptable. My wife has been here for hours, clearly in distress, and no one has done a proper examination. Is this how you treat all your patients, or just the ones who look like us?" The nurse's face flushed red, but before she could respond, May's legs gave out completely. She slid from her chair despite Dev's attempt to catch her, the world tilting sideways as her vision darkened around the edges. The cleaning lady shouted for help, her voice carrying more authority than any of them had managed all night. This time, even the dismissive nurse couldn't ignore what was happening. She pressed the emergency call button, finally showing the first signs of genuine concern. Other staff members rushed over, moving with the urgency that should have been present hours ago. Someone brought a wheelchair, another began taking vital signs. Through the fog of pain and dizziness, May could hear fragments of conversation around her. Blood pressure dropping. Possible hemorrhage. Why wasn't this caught earlier? The same staff who had spent the night dismissing her concerns now moved with frantic energy, their earlier indifference replaced by belated professional concern. As they wheeled her toward the emergency treatment area, May caught glimpses of worried faces, heard snippets of urgent medical terminology, the same terms she had tried to use earlier, only to be dismissed as someone who didn't know what she was talking about. The irony would have made her laugh if she hadn't been in so much pain. Dev followed close behind, his hand clasped tightly around his wife's cold fingers, his heart pounding with fear and anger. The morning shift was about to begin, bringing with it a revelation that would transform not just May's care, but potentially the entire hospital's approach to treating patients. But right now, all that mattered was getting her the help she had desperately needed for hours. The morning shift change brought fresh faces, and with them, a complete transformation in May's treatment. As a new nurse picked up the chart, her eyes widened while scanning the patient information. She quickly flipped back to the first page, then looked up at May with a completely different expression than any staff member had shown all night. "Dr. Maiwang," she said, her voice filled with sudden recognition. "Chief of Neurosurgery at Central Medical." The nurse's face paled as she realized the woman they'd left suffering in the waiting room for hours was one of the most respected surgeons in the state. The clipboard almost slipped from her trembling hands. The news spread through the department like wildfire. Suddenly, the same hallway that had been eerily quiet despite May's pleas for help was buzzing with activity. The hospital administrator appeared as if by magic, straightening his tie as he rushed toward her room. "Dr. Wang, I just heard you were here. I'm absolutely mortified about this situation." Dev watched in disbelief as the very same staff who had dismissed his wife all night now tripped over themselves to help. The nurse who had lectured them about new mother anxiety was nowhere to be seen. Instead, 3 different doctors had appeared, each one apologizing profusely while reviewing her charts. "Your symptoms clearly indicate postpartum complications that should have been addressed immediately," one doctor said, shaking his head in dismay. "I can't understand why proper protocols weren't followed." But both May and Dev knew exactly why. The night staff had made assumptions based on how she looked and spoke, never bothering to read her full information. Through her pain, Mai noticed how everyone now used her correct title, Dr. Wong instead of the condescending sweetie, and honey from earlier. The same medical terminology she'd used all night, which had been dismissed as internet research, was now met with professional understanding and respect. The hospital administrator hovered anxiously nearby as the medical team worked. Dr. Wong, I want you to know we take this very seriously. This is not how we treat our patients. Any of our patients. The irony of his words wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Mai managed a weak smile, thinking about all the other patients who might not have the advantage of a medical title to finally receive proper care. Tests were ordered and rushed through with unprecedented speed. The results confirmed what Mai had suspected hours ago. She was experiencing a serious postpartum complication that could have been dangerous if left untreated much longer. The doctors exchanged worried glances, knowing that their delay in treatment could have had severe consequences. Dev stood by his wife's bedside, holding her hand as they finally administered the necessary medications. He couldn't help but notice how the staff now spoke directly to Mai, explaining every procedure and medication in detail. The same courtesy they had refused to extend when they thought she was just another patient who didn't understand medical terms. A young resident who hadn't been part of the night shift team quietly approached Mi's bed. Dr. Wong, she said softly, I've read all your research papers on improving patient care protocols. The irony of this situation. She trailed off, looking genuinely distressed. Your work literally emphasizes the importance of listening to patients, regardless of their background. The morning light streamed through the hospital window as Mai received the treatment she had needed all along. The respect and care that should be every patient's right had finally been extended to her, but only after they discovered her title. As the medication began to take effect and the pain started to subside, Mi's mind was already working on how to turn this horrible experience into positive change. The administrator was still making promises about investigations and policy changes, but Mai knew that real change would require more than just apologies and paperwork. As a doctor herself, she had witnessed subtle biases in healthcare, but experiencing it firsthand as a patient had opened her eyes to just how devastating those biases could be. The contrast in treatment was so stark it was almost painful to witness. The same emergency department that had been practically ghosting Mai for hours now buzzed with activity like a disturbed beehive. Every few minutes, someone new would pop in to check on Dr. Wong, their faces a mix of professional concern and barely hidden embarrassment. The morning shift doctor couldn't stop apologizing as she reviewed Mai's charts. Your symptoms were textbook postpartum complications, she said, shaking her head in disbelief. The night team should have recognized. She trailed off, realizing she was stating the obvious. Mai had known exactly what was happening to her body. She'd been trying to tell them all night. Dev sat in the corner of the room, watching the parade of apologetic staff members with a mixture of relief and anger. A nurse brought Mai a fresh water pitcher with actual ice this time, not the lukewarm tap water they dismissively handed her earlier. Another staff member appeared with extra pillows, asking in an overly cheerful voice if Dr. Wong needed anything else to be comfortable. The medication we've administered should start taking effect soon, the doctor explained, now speaking to Mai as an equal rather than talking down to her. We'll need to monitor you closely for the next few hours. The same monitoring that should have started the moment she walked through the emergency room doors, Mai thought to herself. Through the window, Mai could see some of the night shift staff leaving, their heads down as they hurried past her room. The nurse who had been particularly dismissive practically ran to the elevator, clutching her bag like a shield. Word had clearly spread out who their difficult patient really was. The hospital administrator returned, this time with the chief of emergency medicine in tow. Dr. Wong, I can't express how disturbed I am by what happened here, the chief began, his face grave. I want you to know we're launching a full investigation into the night shift's conduct. May noticed how he kept glancing at the hospital's logo on his lab coat, probably already worried about the reputation damage this incident could cause. As the pain medication finally brought real relief, May found her voice growing stronger. "This isn't just about me," she said, looking directly at the administrators. "How many other patients have endured similar treatment? How many didn't have the advantage of a medical degree to finally get proper care?" Dev squeezed his wife's hand, proud of her ability to think of others even in her moment of distress. The administrator shifted uncomfortably, probably realizing that Dr. Wong wasn't going to be pacified with simple apologies and promises of internal reviews. A young medical student who had been observing quietly from the doorway stepped forward. "Dr. Wong," she said hesitantly, "I've been here since early morning, watching how differently you were treated before and after they knew your position. It's opened my eyes to something I never want to be part of in my future practice." The sincerity in the student's voice offered a glimmer of hope. Maybe this awful experience could spark real change, starting with the next generation of medical professionals. Mai managed a small smile, remembering her own days as a medical student and how important it was to learn from real-world examples, even negative ones. As the morning wore on, the treatment Mai should have received from the start was finally in full swing. Regular vital checks, proper pain management, careful monitoring of her postpartum complications. The staff now spoke to her with respect, explained every procedure, and actually listened when she spoke about her symptoms. But the question hung heavy in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Why did it take a medical degree to be treated with basic human dignity? As May's physical pain began to subside, she knew this incident wouldn't, and shouldn't, be swept under the rug. The real healing needed wasn't just physical, it was institutional, and that would be a much longer journey. Once the initial flurry of attention died down and the proper medical treatment was underway, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. The hospital room was quieter now, with only the steady beep of monitors and the occasional footsteps in the hallway breaking the silence. Mi's physical pain was finally under control, but her mind was racing with thoughts of what could have gone terribly wrong. "Your blood pressure dropped to dangerous levels," the attending physician explained, reviewing her latest test results. "If we hadn't caught it when we did." He stopped, probably realizing this wasn't helping. Mi, as a doctor herself, knew exactly what could have happened. The thought made her blood run cold. How many other patients had faced similar situations without her advantages? Dev paced near the window, still processing his anger at the night's events. "I kept telling them something was wrong," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "We both did. They just didn't want to hear it." The morning sunlight streaming through the window seemed to mock the darkness of their overnight ordeal. A knock on the door interrupted their thoughts. The hospital's chief of staff entered, looking appropriately grave. "Dr. Wong, I've reviewed the preliminary reports of what happened last night," he began, clearing his throat uncomfortably. "The delay in your treatment was completely unacceptable. We've already suspended several staff members pending a full investigation." May adjusted herself in the hospital bed, gathering her strength. "Suspending a few people won't fix the real problem," she said firmly. "This is about systemic bias. It's about assumptions and prejudices that put patients at risk." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by the memory of those long hours of dismissal and disrespect. The chief of staff nodded, perhaps too quickly. "We have diversity training programs in place." He started, but May cut him off. "Clearly, they're not enough. I was treated like I couldn't understand basic medical concepts until someone realized I was a doctor. That's not a training issue. That's a culture issue." A young nurse who had been checking Mi's vitals paused in her work, listening intently. Her face showed the impact of May's words, perhaps recognizing similar situations she had witnessed or even been part of without realizing it. Dev moved to his wife's bedside, his protective instincts still on high alert despite the improvement in her condition. The cleaning staff showed more concern than the medical team, he pointed out. They saw my wife as a person, not just another patient to dismiss. The chief of staff shifted his weight uncomfortably, probably thinking about potential lawsuits and public relations nightmares. But Mai had something else in mind. "I want to work with your hospital," she said, surprising everyone in the room. Not as a patient or as a victim, but as someone who can help implement real change. The tension in the room shifted slightly. The chief of staff leaned forward, intrigued. "What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Wong?" "A complete overhaul of your patient interaction protocols," Matt replied, her professional expertise shining through despite her exhaustion. "New guidelines for staff training, regular audits of patient treatment patterns, anonymous feedback systems for patients to report discriminatory behavior without fear of impact on their care." As she spoke, the young nurse had stopped pretending to check the monitors and was openly listening. Other staff members had paused in the hallway, drawn in by the intensity of the conversation. This wasn't just about one bad night anymore, it was about changing the entire system. "We need to create a culture where every patient is treated with respect from the moment they walk through those doors," Mai continued, her voice carrying the weight of both her professional expertise and personal experience. "Where assumptions about someone's understanding or background don't determine the quality of care they receive." The hospital room had become more than just a place of recovery. It was becoming the starting point for something much bigger. The very place where Mai had experienced such blatant discrimination might now become ground zero for meaningful change in patient care standards. 2 days later, Mai sat in a conference room at Memorial General. Her medical charts spread out before her on the polished table. The room was packed with hospital administrators, department heads, and legal representatives, all gathered to address what had happened that terrible night. The air felt heavy with tension and unspoken words. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Security footage showed Mai and Dev requesting help multiple times throughout the night. The timestamps on her medical records revealed dangerous delays in care. The nurse's station recordings captured the dismissive comments and inappropriate laughter. Each piece of evidence made several people in the room squirm in their seats. "Let's review the timeline," the hospital's legal counsel said, pushing her glasses up her nose. "You arrived at 9:43 p.m. with clear postpartum complications. The first actual medical assessment didn't occur until—" she paused, double-checking her notes, "5:27 a.m. the following morning. That's nearly 8 hours of neglect." Dev, sitting beside his wife, gripped the armrests of his chair. The cleaning lady who had shown such kindness that night had been invited to speak too. She sat quietly in the corner, still in her work uniform, her presence a powerful reminder that compassion shouldn't require a medical degree. "I've brought similar concerns to management before," she said when asked to speak, her voice soft but steady. "Sometimes staff treat people differently based on how they look or sound. But nobody ever listens to a cleaning lady." Her words hung in the air, adding another layer to the pattern of discrimination being revealed. The emergency department head tried to defend his staff. "We have protocols in place," he began, but Mai interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. "Protocols that were completely ignored based on prejudice. Let's be honest about what happened here." She pulled out her own detailed notes from that night. "At 10:15 p.m., I explained my symptoms using proper medical terminology. The nurse responded by telling me to use simple words. At 11:30 p.m., I described my medical history, which was dismissed as internet research. At 1:45 a.m., I requested urgent care due to increasing pain, and was told to stop being dramatic." The room fell silent as Mai continued. "But here's what's most troubling. At 5:27 a.m., when my title was discovered, I received immediate care. The exact same symptoms that were dismissed all night suddenly became urgent concerns. The only thing that changed was your knowledge of my profession." The hospital's chief of staff looked physically pained. Dr. Wong, we want to make this right. We're prepared to offer. But Mai held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I'm not interested in a settlement, she said firmly. I want systematic change. Real change. She pulled out a folder and began distributing documents to everyone in the room. This is my proposed action plan. It includes mandatory bias training, but goes far beyond that. The room buzzed as people flipped through her detailed proposals. Anonymous patient feedback systems. Regular audits of treatment patterns based on patient demographics. New guidelines for patient communication. A complete overhaul of the complaint system to protect vulnerable patients. The most damaging part of discrimination in healthcare is that people die from it. Mai continued, her voice carrying the weight of both professional and personal experience. They die because their pain isn't taken seriously. Because their concerns are dismissed. Because assumptions are made about their intelligence or understanding. A young resident doctor who had been quietly observing spoke up. During my training, we had one lecture on cultural competency. One, and it was optional. Others in the room nodded, the inadequacy of current training becoming glaringly obvious. The cleaning lady raised her hand hesitantly. Sometimes I see patients crying in the hallways after being dismissed by staff, but they're afraid to complain because they think it will make their care worse. Her simple observation cut through all the corporate speak and legal jargon, striking at the heart of the problem. Mai stood up, her presence commanding the room despite her recent ordeal. This isn't just about apologies or legal settlements. It's about saving lives. Every patient who walks through those doors deserves the same level of care I received, but only after you discovered I was a doctor. The hospital's response to Mai's experience came swiftly and publicly. Within 2 weeks, major changes began rolling out across all departments. The administration, faced with irrefutable evidence of discrimination, had no choice but to take decisive action. The story had sparked a necessary conversation about bias in healthcare that couldn't be ignored. The first change came in the emergency department. New signs in multiple languages appeared, clearly explaining patient rights and the proper procedures for reporting concerns. The night shift staff underwent a complete restructuring, with several members being reassigned or let go. But more importantly, the entire hospital began implementing Mai's comprehensive reform plan. We're starting with the basics, Mai explained to a group of medical students gathered in the hospital's lecture hall. She had been invited to lead a series of training sessions, turning her traumatic experience into a teaching opportunity. Every patient who walks through these doors has a story, has knowledge about their own body, and deserves to be heard. The cleaning lady who had shown such compassion that night was now part of the hospital's newly formed patient advocacy committee. Sometimes the smallest kindness makes the biggest difference, she told the staff during a training session. Her presence reminded everyone that compassion and professionalism should come from all levels of hospital personnel. Dev supported his wife's mission, attending meetings and sharing their story from a family member's perspective. Watching someone you love being ignored and dismissed, it changes you, he told a group of nurses during a training session. But watching the system actually change in response, that gives you hope. The hospital's new protocols required staff to document not just medical symptoms, but also how they communicated with patients. Random audits would review these interactions, looking for patterns of bias or dismissal. Patient feedback became mandatory, with surveys available in multiple languages and formats. One morning, Mai received an email that brought tears to her eyes. A young mother wrote about her recent experience in the same emergency department. They listened to me. They treated me with respect. When I tried to explain my symptoms, nobody talked down to me. I know it's because of the changes you helped make happen. The hospital's training programs were completely revamped. Instead of one-time diversity seminars, ongoing education became mandatory. Role-playing exercises helped staff understand how their words and actions affected patients. Security footage from Mai's night in the ER, with her permission, became a powerful teaching tool. Watch how the same symptoms are treated differently before and after they discovered my profession, Mai would say during training sessions. Now imagine this happening to someone without the power to fight back. Imagine it happening to your mother, your sister, your friend. The impact spread beyond Memorial General. Other hospitals in the region began requesting copies of the new protocols. Medical schools reached out to incorporate Mai's experience into their curriculum. What had started as one horrible night was transforming into a movement for change. The young medical student who had witnessed the dramatic shift in Mai's treatment wrote her thesis on healthcare bias, interviewing numerous patients about their experiences. Dr. Wong's case wasn't unique, she wrote. It just happened to someone who could force the system to listen. Even most skeptical staff members couldn't deny the positive changes. Emergency room wait times decreased as patients were evaluated more efficiently, without prejudice or assumptions. Patient satisfaction scores improved dramatically. The hospital's reputation, initially threatened by the incident, was actually enhanced by their commitment to reform. One evening, as Mai was leaving after another training session, she passed by the emergency department. The same doors she had walked through that terrible night now looked different. New families were coming in, being greeted with respect and attention. The night shift staff was attentive and professional, treating each patient with equal consideration. It's not perfect yet, Mai told Dev as they walked to their car. Real change takes time. But at least now, when someone says something's wrong, they're more likely to be heard, regardless of how they look or sound. 1 year after that life-changing night in the emergency room, Mai stood at a podium in front of a packed auditorium. Medical professionals from across the country had gathered for a healthcare conference where she was the keynote speaker. Her story had become a catalyst for change that reached far beyond one hospital's walls. Change doesn't just happen with new policies, she began, her voice carrying the weight of both professional expertise and personal experience. It happens when we look in the mirror and acknowledge our own biases, when we question our assumptions, when we truly listen to every patient who walks through our doors. In the audience, she could see familiar faces. The cleaning lady, now promoted to patient advocacy director, sat proudly in the front row. The young medical student who had witnessed her case was there too, now a resident physician leading her own initiative on healthcare equality. Dev watched from the side, beaming with pride at how his wife had transformed a traumatic experience into a movement for positive change. Last month, a woman came to our emergency room, Mai continued, sharing a recent success story. She didn't speak much English, but she knew something was wrong with her heart. Under our old system, she might have been dismissed. Instead, our new protocols ensured she received immediate attention. The staff discovered she was having a heart attack. Today, she's alive because we learned to listen. The presentation screen behind her showed statistics from the past year. Patient satisfaction scores up by 40%, medical error rates down by 35%, and most importantly, improved health outcomes across all patient demographics. The numbers told a powerful story of what could happen when healthcare truly served everyone equally. But our work isn't done, Mai emphasized, clicking to the next slide. Every day, somewhere in this country, a patient is being dismissed because of how they look, how they speak, or where they come from. Every day, someone's pain is being ignored because of unconscious bias. Every day, we have the opportunity to do better. She shared how the program had spread to 30 other hospitals, each adapting the protocols to their unique needs while maintaining the core principle. Every patient deserves equal respect and care. Training videos based on real experiences were now mandatory in medical schools across the state. The ripple effect continued to grow. The young resident who had been on duty the morning Mai's status was discovered stood up during the Q&A session. Dr. Wong's case changed how I practice medicine, she shared. Now, when I train new staff, I tell them, treat every patient like they could be the chief of surgery at another hospital, because every patient deserves that level of respect. After the conference, May visited the emergency room where her story began. The transformation was remarkable. Gone were the dismissive attitudes and assumptions. Instead, she saw staff members actively listening to patients, using translation services when needed, and treating everyone with professional respect. The hospital's waiting room now featured a wall of thank you notes from patients of all backgrounds. They heard me, one note read. For the first time in my life, I felt like my health concerns mattered. Another simply stated, "Thank you for seeing me as a person, not just a patient." As Mai prepared to leave, a young mother approached her, carrying a sleeping baby. "I read about what happened to you," she said softly. "When I came here last week with my sick child, they treated me with such respect. They explained everything, answered all my questions. That wouldn't have happened a year ago." May thought back to that terrible night, remembering the pain and frustration. But now, standing in the same emergency room where she had once been dismissed and ignored, she saw something different. Hope. Real, tangible change that was saving lives and transforming how healthcare was delivered. The worst moments in our lives can become the catalyst for the best changes, she told Dev as they walked out together. Sometimes it takes one story to open people's eyes, but it takes everyone's commitment to create lasting change.